It is a hit in 63 countries. It's number one for Netflix in 63 countries right now. Now, simple math means that it's a hit in 60 countries that don't speak English.
And then the dying zone. And so that in the dying zone, you have 20,000 LSPs, they're saying.
All of which, apart from the ones that are tech innovative, are at risk of dying, according to this matrix.
Welcome to SlaterPod 49. Hi, Esther.
Hi, Florian.
How's it going there in London?
It's okay. Yeah, we should soon hear about what happens post-national lockdown. Back to the tiers.
Back to the tiers, back to the tiers. Yes. Tiers, T-I-E-R.
Crucially,
Okay.
yeah.
Crucially.
Not sobbing. Not yet.
Yeah, now there's a big fight going on here. There's a big debate going on whether they're going to open the ski resorts because the Germans and the Italians are saying that they want to shut them down, and the Swiss are saying no, we're going to open. We're going to open. Actually, the ski resort I go to is actually open. Well, they have already opened. So you get all these images of people like queuing up, waiting in line, and then people getting upset about it. Anyways, welcome to SlaterPod, your favorite language industry podcast. I'm sure you have others, but this is your favorite one, I hope. On the pod today is Chris Fettner, the managing director of EGA, the New Entertainment Globalization Association. We spoke about it last time, and now we're super glad that he made time for us in this in the Thanksgiving week to join us on the pod. Chris was with BBC Discovery, and since 2012 he was with Netflix, and now started the EGA. And so he's going to tell us a lot more about media localization and the history and the key drivers. Again, we recorded this before this one, so super interesting discussion. Make sure to either skip forward or listen through and listen to that. Very, very interesting. It's a very different space from the rest of the localization industry. We said it many times, but this kind of made it again obvious to me. And also, there really is a need for an organization that kind of gathers these types of companies, right? How many is it now?
He said as of Tuesday, whatever it was 73. So you got the 10 founding companies, and then there were the 50 that they had extra on launch, and then I think they've added 13 or so extra again.
And it happened very quickly. This wasn't like something that they planned for years, right? So anyway, you don't want to miss this. Next week, SlaterCon Remote, we're ramping up. We were on some dry runs, test calls, etc. This week, so all systems are go. Just thanks again to the sponsors. We got Intentus, the lead partner, Doraworth, Language Services as the networking partner, and then AI Media. Newly listed AI Media is our live captioning sponsor. So we're going to have live captionings throughout the event. That's going to be cool. Today on our agenda are dying LSPs. First, we're going to talk about dying LSPs or not. 26 million words up for tender. Then we're going to talk about speccing VRI on the NYCE. SE? Sorry, SE, yeah, sorry. Yeah, I will tell you what this is about.
The NYSE in NYC. There we go.
Yeah,
That's what you're thinking.
Spacking, a concept that I didn't know anything about until maybe like a few months ago. But now we have the first spec in the language industry. That's a special acquisition vehicle. We'll tell you a bit more about that. Verbit, raise some money. We'll speak about that. But first, a bold statement coming out of New Zealand that there's 20,000 LSPs that are dying. Where did we get this from, Esther?
Well, this was from the presentation of Straker Translations, in which accompanied their first half results.
Thanks, Straker, for another discussion point here. Again, public listed, needs to put out all of this information, and I like it because it's a relatively small LSP still, and so it's quite interesting how they're seeing this. And so basically, long story short, we spoke about their results before. I think it's 6-month revenue, right? Roughly $10 million, 60% from enterprise customer. kind of break even on the EBITDA line, a bit of a margin, well, not tightening, deteriorating margin a little bit because of the COVID price pressure they said, etc. And then, of course, they announced that big deal with IBM, I think a week ago. But what I found interesting, and we should talk about this, is one slide where they basically mapped out the industry, the language industry, into like 4 different boxes. So one would be the tech zone, that's kind of at the, what is it? Right? Far right.
Yeah.
Then on top of that is the optimal zone, then the scale zone, and then the dying zone. And so so that in the dying zone, you have 20,000 LSPs, they're saying. On the tech zone, they see themselves and a few other dots, right? And then on the optimal zone, there's only 1 dot. I wonder who that is. And then on the scale zone, which is revenues north of 50 million, is, they say, 40 larger LSPs with global coverage, but lacking innovation. So let's just unpack this for a second, okay? So the dying zone, they're saying...
So these are LSPs under $50 million in dollars, according to their chart, because there's a dividing line on the y-axis between those who make $50 million a year and those who don't. 20,000 LSPs beneath $50 million in revenue, apparently, all of which, apart from the ones that are tech innovative, are at risk of dying, according to this matrix.
That's a brutal matrix. So they're at risk of dying, but also the ones that are above and are the 40 LSPs. So basically the top 40 LSPs, they're not safe either.
That's what we would call mostly the super agencies and the leaders, really, by our sort of 4 categorization standards.
So according to Straker, those guys are large and they have global coverage, but they lack innovation.
Apart from 1.
All 40 of them, except 1.
Yeah, there's 40, and then there's, one dot. I guess that equals 1 company. But
so there's 1 innovative company, and then
there's 1 innovative company making more than $50 million, apparently.
And then below the line,
maybe we're overinterpreting it. Maybe it's not quite so literal. Maybe that dot is not 1 company. Maybe it's, represents numerous companies.
We need to bring Grant Straker on the podcast to explain this to us. And then below in the tech zone, moving up towards the optimal zone, of course, is Straker. So I think this is quite bold, and it's incredibly bold. And the death of LSPs and translators, I mean, it's been called so many times. I think let's not even rehash that. But even if you say that all those those 20,000 LSPs have an issue with innovation, proprietary innovation, I think that's not true, because I mean, maybe they don't have the internal development teams to really ramp up the innovation, but there's so much innovation that you can buy. I mean, we spoke about SmartCat's funding recently. Well, I mean, why don't you just move to SmartCat? You have a great system that's obviously developed by very smart people. So on the tech side, if you can remain very competitive if you want to. And then also, I think this is completely underestimating the niche and local expertise of the entire industry. I mean, it's not just about tech and the platform, it's about obviously so many other things, and having the right resources, having access to, again, the right linguists, and of course having the local connection to the client, which is what in this industry so many people tend to underestimate, that, being locally strong, having those relationships with your local client base is super important. So, yeah, I don't know. Maybe that was, I don't know, maybe they're a bit they're riding a high now, because after this IBM deal, which is like in the mid-single digit millions, they're thinking it's, their shares were up 75% on that deal news of IBM, and now they're down 10 to 20% since. But long story short, I think it's a very simplistic view, and I would like to bring Grant on the podcast and challenge him on that view. So, head over to
Let's do it.
Head over to their filing and look at that beautiful little map there with the dying LSPs. One organization that is looking for a bunch of dying LSPs, but prospering LSPs is the World Intellectual Property Organization, a 3-hour train ride, south, west from here in Geneva. What's going on there?
Yeah, so WIPO, interesting. They're looking for, niche LSPs as well. So they're looking for people who are specialized in particular within patents and IP. But they actually reached out to us because they're really keen to advertise this tender that's going to be coming up, massive tender. They currently are in the call for expressions of interest phase, and it's an open tender, so open to LSPs everywhere, all around the world, as long as you can do patents, I think. So this is into English from German, Spanish, French, and Russian. Big tender. WIPO, I think they've said around $4.5 to $5.5 million on translation each year. So
hey, that's like IBM.
It's like IBM. There we go. Yeah, big client. But I mean, this probably is going to go to multiple LSPs, I'd imagine. Although I don't know if we asked them about that specifically. But yeah, interesting that they reached out to us and that they're obviously keen to canvass the market and see who's out there, what expertise the LSPs do have. And WIPO is an interesting organization, really. It's a self-funded agency of the UN, like you said, based in Geneva. And they have their own internal resources. They've got in-house translators. They have WIPO Translate, which is the MT system that I think we've talked about in the past. Interesting prospective client. So LSPs, anyone who's interested, you need to, it's to cover patent cooperation treaty documents. So this is sort of patent abstract, patentability reports, and the volume is in the region of 50,000 plus documents a year, totaling around 26 million words annually.
I think they're very smart in terms of the tech they have. I mean, I remember WIPO or WIPO or whatever the correct pronunciation is. I mean, the WIPO Translate has been one of the very first tools to really deploy NMT in like real life operations back in 2017, if I remember correctly. After that, it kind of snowballed, but they were really the first ones, in my view, that I heard about that really productized this very quickly. Because the volumes are so large that the FYI volumes, I guess, at the WIPO, that it made sense for them to do that. And so
they have. Oh, sorry, carry on.
No, I mean, again, they approached us for this, and we cover it gladly. I mean, anybody who wants to advertise a major RFP, we're more than happy to put it in our editorials, so let us know. And so they are looking for, in a sense, not just the usual suspects, whoever that might be, but give it a shot if you're if you think there may be an opportunity for you with that particular tender. So yeah.
Well, and also to say that since we were talking about machine translation, that this is human services, so human translation only, because they want these documents to be publication ready and need to be proofed by an English native. Yeah,
definitely. This is not MT. I mean, they have their own MT and they're pretty smart in how they manage it. But this is the white glove portion of content there. All right, moving from Geneva to New York, we got the language industry's first SPAC. And if you don't know what the SPAC is, you're not alone. A SPAC is a special acquisition vehicle. And for further information, please check out Wikipedia or Investopedia. I have no idea what this is. But I've heard it on some of the business podcasts I'm following, like the All In podcast. And so they've spoken about this. I think this is it's kind of an empty shell company that is listed first and is run by like people that, like experienced business people, operators, etc. And you kind of invest in this hoping that this particular vehicle or these individuals are then going to be able to acquire an actual business and then buy it, merge it. And so basically you do a quick IPO. Like you don't have to go through all of the paperwork to IPO a company, to list a company, but the listed company that's empty buys a private business, and then by default,
an empty meaning that they don't really do anything themselves. So they don't have any it doesn't have any tech, it doesn't have any services, don't really do anything or in and of itself. Yeah. So who did they SPAC?
They SPAC Cloudbreak, which is the owner of an remote interpreting platform called Marti, and they merged it with another company called UpHealth. So they're merging this whole thing into a listed company that's going to be called UpHealth, and that one of the more important service lines is going to be virtual remote interpreting. So under that whole telemedicine umbrella,
video, yeah.
You have got the video remote interpreting. So yeah, I mean, this is interesting, and obviously they're competing with the likes of AMN Healthcare now, which is also listed and acquired Stratus Video. You got LanguageLine, you got Boost Lingo. So that whole U.S. interpreting, virtual interpreting space,
and healthcare as well, in particular, I think.
Yeah.
Is
heating up, and I mean, this is kind of a little bit adjacent to, I guess, the core coverage of our kind of core localization and translation industry, but it's a fast growing area, especially now, of course, with COVID, long term. So good for them.
It was a plus $1 billion transaction as well, I think, all in all.
Yeah, that's right. And how big is the interpreting? Do you have any data points on that Marti thing?
Yeah, we did. We did. They said, I think they told us actually earlier this year when they actually received funding from somebody else, 10 million in funding they got, but they told us that they provide more than 20. This is Cloudbreak Health, provide more than 26 million minutes of medical interpretation to more than 2 million patients. So I guess that's an annual figure. And they support nearly 250 languages, and of which 50 via live video via the platform.
That would be great if we knew the price per minute for VRI off the top of our heads.
I think we do have, I don't have it to hand. We do have some metrics, though, I think, that we've in the healthcare interpreting report.
Yeah, we need to consult back. Wasn't it like $1? But anyway, I have no idea. I don't remember. So 26 million minutes. Sizable business. That's a lot of interpreting. Moving from one adjacent part of the language industry to another adjacent part, which we typically don't cover, but because it's so large, we're going to talk about it right now. It's transcription and captioning platform. Well, provider. I think it's better. It's more apt to say provider. Verbit raised 60 million in Series C. 60 million. What are some of the key bullet points there?
Yeah, so as you said, transcription and captioning, it's based on AI. So they have a focus on underlying technology of automatic speech recognition. In terms of the actual deal itself, it was new and existing investors that were involved in the round, and it was led by Sapphire Ventures, a new investor, and 4 or 5 others as well. So the company itself apparently is majority investor owned. So about 70% of the business is owned by the investors, and the remaining 30% by company executives and employees. They didn't give us any specific financial metrics, but they've said that they've grown, I think, 400% year on year in annual recurring revenues, which has led to tens of millions of dollars in revenue, is how they phrased it in our Q&A. And they have 110 employees currently, hoping to ramp that up to around 200 by the end of 2020. So they don't have long to hire. But all in all, they've raised 125 million in less than 4 years. So about half of it in this round.
And they're a service business. This is not it's obviously heavily technology driven, right? But they do the service.
They do. And I think they're putting a big emphasis on the customization for their clients. So custom service tailored to very specific customer use cases. So they started out, they were working primarily for legal and educational use, providing transcription and captioning. They've widened that out to include the media sector, they said, and they also plan to roll it out to governments, finance, and insurance sectors. And they've got this customized proprietary ASR, automatic speech recognition. It's patented, but I think they've said, we really try to tailor this and develop it for our client to fit the specific use cases of their clients.
Yeah, because that would be unlike some of the tools that are using like the Google ASR API. Google Automatic Speech Recognition API. I think TransPerfect just came out with a press release a couple of days ago where they're saying that they're using the Google ASR API. So if you want to raise that kind of money, you probably want to have your proprietary technology there. I think even the tool that we're using is essentially plugging into the Google ASR. And so when you're saying that they're going to go into media, that would maybe be like that live captioning segment of the market that AI media also plays in. So
yeah, I think live captioning, I mean, I don't know generally what they mean by media, because obviously it can be used as quite a broad term and not just entertainment. But I mean, they've said, for example, on the legal side, they do things like help remote proceedings and digital depositions through live captioning already, or live transcription and live captioning. So that's something that they've, I think, been able to provide throughout COVID. And they now have new integrations with web conferencing platforms as well. They've said they're integrated with Zoom and WebEx. So yeah, I guess live captioning, live transcription through Zoom and WebEx also.
Maybe they're going to become one of the Zaps. Although, remember the Zaps, the Zoom apps? Although I just read that Zoom had to rename it. They can't call it Zaps anymore because you know that company Zapier, which is like whenever two tools don't have an integration, you can go via Zapier, and Zapier then does that integration. So apparently, some of those Zapier integrations are called Zaps. So Zoom had to get rid of that. So I don't know. Because at that point, we talked about it because there was no remote interpreting Zap on Zoom, but there was Rev for transcription, right?
Oh, okay.
So let's see if Verba can get on that Zoom best of breed roster. Look, I think it's an interesting time. You're seeing so much funding also around the edges, not just the core kind of MT and localization space, but really for us core, right? But around the whole NLP space, but
ASR.
Really in terms of the products, ASR, right? And with AI media, the captioning, etc. So I find it fascinating. And now that we're doing again more podcasts, more with Hopin now, the live conference, which you could actually stream we could stream out of our conferencing platform, right? And then you could imagine a world where like the live caption is going on, you can have some kind of MT of the live captioning, etc. So there's all of these emerging use cases in a world that's gone, completely remote. Obviously there's a big push towards making this really work. Interesting.
I think it's cool that we're having this live captioning or whatever for SlateCon Remote. I wonder how many people are going to be paying more attention to how accurate the captioning is than the actual content.
No pressure.
Because
AI
obviously
media.
we're going to have a ton of linguists and LSPs on the conference as well.
No pressure. AI media. I wasn't on that particular call, but I think there will be a slight lag. I mean, it's not fully. It's not fully AI. I think there will be a little bit of a lag where they look at it, and depends on the accent, of course. I mean, if somebody like you or Andrew speak, then it's probably easier than if you have a more accented way of speaking than like me.
Maybe they're training their engines based on our YouTube videos as we speak.
Yeah, hopefully not. Don't analyze my voice.
Don't give them any ideas.
Over to a American accent to California, to the city of Los Angeles, with Chris Fettner again, the first managing director of EGA, the Entertainment Globalization Association. So let's hop over there right now. Cheers.
Thanks.
And welcome back to Slater Pod. Today with Chris Fettner, the Managing Director of the new Entertainment Globalization Association. Hello, Chris.
Hey, thanks for having me, Florian.
Hi, Chris. Hiya.
Hey, how are you doing? Thank you.
Great. So where does this podcast find you, Chris?
I am in the basement of my house in Los Angeles, California, bracing for Thanksgiving.
Yeah, appreciate you doing this ahead of Thanksgiving. Thanks so much. LA, well, yes, of course, LA. That's the center of all the entertainment industry. So natural you'd be there. So as I said, we have Chris Fettner here, Managing Director of the New Entertainment Globalization Association. So Chris, kind of how do you pronounce it? EGA or EGA, or what's the problem?
EGA typically, yeah, is what we're, yeah.
All right. So EGA is the New Global Association for all things media, localization, globalization. And you guys just launched on November 17th, right?
Correct. Yeah, correct.
Well, congratulations on that, Chris.
We still have the new car smell.
All right. So Chris, you've been in the media log space for a couple of decades in like post-production related, localization related roles, including Discovery, the BBC, and in your latest roles with Netflix. So why don't you tell us a bit more about your background, how you came to, come into the space and your previous roles, etc., up to EGA? Yeah.
So, I grew up, I grew up loving movies and loving entertainment and watching lots of entertainment. I was a bit of a latchkey kid during the time when VCRs became a big thing. And I had a sister who worked for a video store. So that gave me a lot of free time and access to a lot of content. So I used to love to just watch TV shows and movies. And, basically, you got into this business and, but I was a very highly technical person, and I enjoyed technical things. And so I gravitated towards fixing technical problems and large scale operational problems. And my first experience with localization was actually quite pedestrian. It was actually just changing US versions of shows for Discovery Channel into UK versions, which I know that sounds like it wouldn't be much in the way of localization, but we had to change measurement units and general colloquialisms and things like that. And so, and I have to hand it to Discovery. They were very quick to realize that localization was relevant to how something resonated with a member population or a viewing population. So they did take that time. It was called the UK Reversioning Project. And they took the time. They would re-edit in some cases. They'd put new graphics in. And I worked on that project, fairly early in my career. And then found myself working for the BBC. And the BBC, I had less to do with localization, although I did a little bit with Latin American Spanish, because at the time, I don't know if it's still the case, but that was actually that whole localization effort was run out of the Americas, because it was primarily servicing Latin America through the US sales office. And so I used to handle a little bit of that work. It wasn't until I joined Netflix and helped with them launching in 190 countries that I became very acquainted with localization and the importance of it in terms of finding audiences, and opening up markets, and also particularly for streaming platforms, making sure that people understand localization. The quality of localization is very relevant to how people feel about your product. If it's done badly, they don't say X company did that badly, or the studio provided a bad asset. They say Netflix is a bad product because it's not very well done in terms of the localization. And so that was a lesson we learned very early on, particularly when we launched in Latin America. And so we set about to kind of change the industry and make it very quality focused, and try to make sure that we got assets that were really good. And so, I had been at Netflix a long time, and it was time for me to move on and do something different. I was in a very good place with regards to my stock participation at Netflix, and I wasn't ready to completely not work at my age, but I wanted to find something that was a good fit for me, good fit for my interests and aspirations, and also skills. And I have a huge affinity for localization. I think the people that I meet in this industry have two really great redeeming qualities. They are usually very intelligent because they're multilingual, and I think that just inherently, especially people that are professionally multilingual, they tend to be very intelligent people, smart people, and then they're very passionate. They love what they do. Sometimes that passion can be complicated to work with, but generally speaking, they're people that want to do an awesome job, and they really feel an affinity for the work they do. And so for me, those were two great characteristics that made me think, well, I'd really like to continue to engage with this industry. And leaving Netflix, that was actually the one area that I felt like I would really miss and pine for, was that connective tissue to that population or that industry. And so when this came about as an opportunity, as a viable opportunity, I was very excited by it, because it sort of allowed me to continue to engage with an industry that I really have an affinity for.
Yeah. So, talking again about EGA, what was the idea behind it specifically? And can you tell us a bit about some of the people and the companies involved in the association?
Yeah. So today the EGA is 73 companies, member companies, plus a lot of actual individual professionals. So it's not only companies. There are a growing population of individuals that are involved in localization that are joining. And I think the general impetus behind the organization is the fact that localization has never been more relevant as global platforms are growing. So next year there will be 9 new streaming platforms that will launch, and in some cases, their actual international expansion has accelerated as a result of COVID, because some of their domestic businesses have been negatively impacted, like theatrical releases or theme parks or other things that they generally have, contributors to their P&L. And so they're actually moving forward streaming because that's something that people can continue to do in the pandemic. And so there's never been a higher demand for this service. And so it seemed like a good time. And it's also a growing industry. It's growing in terms of its contribution to the entertainment financial ecosystem. And so there's never been a better time to try to get more organized around this particular narrow subset of translation services. And so, and it is different. You outlined that in your podcast previously. It's different than other forms of translation. And so it just seemed like before it just became this giant industry, it was a good time to try to bring some order to it, get some organization around it, and try to get some standards and some other things that would not only benefit the industry, but also benefit the clients of these services, the consumer of these services. And so that was really the goal of the organization. And I'd say that the founding companies were all very early parties that were either interested in doing this, but couldn't find the right leader for it, and there had been some attempts in Mesa and other forums to get a group together. But I think it was just a perfect storm of, my availability, an interest for 6 or 7 key companies to kind of pull this together. And then the perfect timing with the growing need for this particular set of services.
Yeah. And you mentioned a bit about standards there. So it sounds like that's going to be one of your areas of focus. Can you tell us generally what the mission is, and some of the operational outputs of the association are going to be?
Yeah. So, obviously there's a lot of, I would call, non-standard assets. It's more of a problem, frankly, on the audio localization side. So the dubbing and access services, less so on subtitling, but you end up with, you get the problem a little bit also with subtitling, but there's something called M&E tracks, right? Which is sort of all the audio tracks except for the dialogue. And there's a mapping exercise of which tracks are where, which assets are present, which are missing. And so what ends up happening, as an example, is a dubbing company will get these assets and they'll spend 2 or 3 days cleaning them up because they're so non-standardized. And it's really in an environment where you're already very, very pressed for time, and you're already, it's challenging to get the best assets created because of the time constraints. it's lost time that could be put into making the dub itself better. And so I think there's a general opinion that if we can get the studios to all agree on what an M&E configuration should look like, and they submit that ultimately it will yield better dubs, because that time that could have been used to make the mix a little bit better or to enhance maybe some of the performances, that time is lost just cleaning up a mess. And so it's those kind of things where we can improve either quality by freeing up time to be invested in quality, or adding scale. I mean, there's a lot of work that goes into even creating good bids, because people will count loops. That's typically how people bid for dubbing. They'll count loops, and you'll see the same piece of content, and one company will count loops a certain way, and they'll end up with 500 loops. Another one will count it a different way, and they'll have 700 loops. And it's like, well, which one is right? And so maybe if we could come up with some standardized methods for, counting loops, or submitting bid templates, or assignment of rights. There's this whole thing with rights, and and every studio has their different contract for the assignment of rights that are like 97% the same. And so it's like, if we can work with the studios to optimize that 3% so everybody can be happy, could we get to a place where local studios don't have to track 20 different assignment of right documents? And is that a huge win for the industry? Yes and no, but what it does do is it allows all the administrative overhead that it takes away from the creative process to get a little bit more streamlined and bring a little more scale to the industry, and make it more efficient. Some of these things are not huge wins; they're incremental, but it still results in a benefit to the retelling of the story.
So that's a lot of stakeholders to bring together, right? And to standards is even also in the non-media portion of the localization industry has always been a big issue, right? So what's the governance model of EGA to bring all these people together and make decisions and actually move forward in those decisions and implement them? How do you bring all these people together? And governance model.
Yeah, it's a challenge. I mean, look, I've been on the SMPTE board of governors for 6 years now, which is, I think, the standards body for motion picture television. And I am often frustrated, and even SMPTE themselves are often frustrated with the speed of getting standards ratified. So it is a challenge. I think the governance specifically for EGA is we are a committee-based organization, which means there's a committee for standards. That committee is comprised of all the membership that chooses to participate. There are officers that not yet defined. Those first meetings are actually starting in December, but the committees will be governed democratically by the membership. And so EGA's main focus is to create the framework and to ensure that the work is getting done, the cadence of the meetings is happening appropriately, and everything else. But we definitely intend to have all the stakeholders as members, and then have all of the membership run the organization through committee. And so it means that it may take a little longer to get these things done because you're trying to build consensus. But the good news is that the pyramids weren't built in a week, but they're still around. And so if you can go through the effort of trying to get people aligned and feel like they're invested in the standard, they're standards that last a long time once they're done. And media localization is not going to go away. This is it's a growing industry, and so if we can get the standards established early days, then the work, time consuming as it may be, will pay long-term dividends. And so that's really the goal. But it really is an organization not run by me. I'm not going to pencil 10 standards that I think are really important. Those ones that I mentioned are ideas, but they may not be the ones that find traction within the organization. And so it'll be really up to the committees to make those decisions.
Was it hard to get everybody to sign up in the first place for a new association, or was that kind of, yeah, we've always been missing this particular forum, or was it a lot of back and forth?
Yeah. It's interesting. No, actually, it wasn't that hard. I was surprised at how hard. I remember telling the board of advisors, look, if we could get 20, we started working on this in October. We hope to launch in November. And I said, if I could get 20 or 25, including 10 that had already signed up as founding members. So if I could basically get 10 to 15 more, I would consider it a pretty good success for COVID-19, a year where it's been pretty bad, and COVID-19 and everything else. And so when I looked down and it was 60 on the launch, I was astonished. It was really like a reality check moment where you're just like, did this just happen? And then to have added 13 more in the week since we launched has been pretty phenomenal. And I really think it's a reaction to the desire to have more connective tissue to the people that they're retelling the stories for. I mean, we have great companies, like really great family-owned companies that have been, they're in their like third generation of doing localization. We have, Dent in Chile, and there is nothing more than Christian loving what he does. He's the CEO. He loves what he does. He wants to he lived in LA for a while, has a huge affinity for it. And I think for so many of them, we have Dubbing Brothers, which are, in France. They're in their second generation of doing this. The Tayeb family, huge family that's involved in localization throughout the industry. I think it's just a reaction to wanting a place where they can all come together and try to connect more with the people that they're retelling their stories for. And so I actually think it's been a little bit like a rubber band that was stretched for many, many years, and then all of a sudden it's snapped back together. And it's actually been really interesting to see and really rewarding to work on it and see how excited people are by the idea of having a forum where they can all work together and concentrate on some of the big issues for the industry.
Do you think OTT and streaming stretched the rubber band a lot over the past 10, 15 years? What has been the impact on that? Before it was maybe a little cottage. Now it's kind of cool and techy. That's at least from the outside. That's the perception. What are your thoughts on?
Well, it's a good question. I mean, I think that it has become more relevant because I think OTT has really dramatically changed the business paradigm, and so I think that, back sort of pre-global OTT platforms, generally speaking, people studios sold content into local markets, and then they mostly forgot about what happened to the content. And because the deal was done, it was a flat rate deal, or it was an output deal, or there was some business paradigm that basically meant there was no more money coming in. So therefore, whatever happened to it, happened to it. So for instance, my partner is from Denmark, and so she grew up watching DR, and basically all the major studios would sell into Denmark. They'd sell to DR or TV2, and then they would just do the subtitle. DR had their own subtitling department, or TV2, and they would just literally do their own work, or they would buy DVDs that the distributor had sold. And so all that work was very local. And I think the difference now is that OTT platforms have made it like a bigger industry for sure, and that it is more international because, OTT platforms, it's hard for them to scale and do deals with 100 different vendors. It's much easier to do them with 10 or 15 big vendors. And so I think there's been a little bit of that. But I also think OTT platforms have brought a lot of opportunity for growth. And I think that most localization companies, if you look at the last 10 years, are better off now than they ever have been. And I think you're even seeing that with an appetite from institutional investors and private equity guys and everything else, venture capital guys, they're not. They don't get into this business because they don't see a future in it. They obviously, they obviously have looked at the market and see that there's an appetite for something there, and that there's a continued need for that service. So I do think that. I mean, look, but I also think I would say that at least at Netflix, we tried really hard to have a great partnership with all of our companies that provided services, and we tried to as much as we could have a good working relationship with them that valued the contribution they made to our ability to scale globally. So I don't know if we caused attention, but we certainly caused attention to the industry, and got people, which then may have created tension in a sort of manifest way. But I think that it was more just about, all of a sudden, this is an industry that if you want to grow your business globally, you have to connect with it in some way or another. I don't know if that really answers your question, but
no, it does.
Yeah, and I think I'm curious to know whether that's changed at all. I imagine it has done in some way. If you're talking about in the past, content would go out to local markets, and then content owners weren't so concerned with what happened afterwards. I mean, do the kind of content owners and streaming platforms now think about localization and globalization slightly differently? For example, is it perceived as a revenue driver all the time, or is it still sometimes a case of, well, we do it because we have to do it in some instances?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think it really depends on the maturity of the platform. So I think in early days, when you want to launch, it's a cost of acquisition of a new customer. So in other words, you look at it and you say, if we want to be relevant in the Latin American market, we have to localize in Spanish. It's the only way that we can grow in a material way is to be in their language. Otherwise, you're looking at just getting a very small percentage of the English-speaking people that have a credit card, that have a general interest in the content that you're offering. So, if you take CuriosityStream, which is a new OTT platform that specifically is nonfiction or documentary style shows. If they wanted to launch in Latin America without Spanish, and you were to draw their Venn diagram, it's going to be people that speak English pretty well, that have a credit card, that like that particular genre of shows. And obviously the overlap is going to be fairly small. And so early days, it's a cost of acquisition to localize. I think that what happens, like all businesses, when they sort of get to the top of the S curve and they start to decelerate, they look at all their costs, and they start to go through this exercise of cost optimization and what makes sense now that we're no longer growing. And if you think about it, it's a dilemma, because they really only have two knobs that they can turn. One is to make their costs lower, their cost of goods sold lower. So they have to reduce COGS, or they have to raise the costs, right? They have to change their ARPU. And that's a very dangerous knob to mess with, because once you start turning it too much, you lose people. So you've spent all this time trying to acquire customers, and then once they voluntarily churn out, getting them to come back can be very challenging. And so the general bias of all companies, and this is true of all industries, is that once they decelerate, they start to look at cost optimization, in which case they start to cut things they value less. And I do think that, sadly, localization has traditionally been one of those things that is like, okay, well, we will reduce the quality and costs until it becomes painful. And then once we get some signal that we've gone too far, then we correct. And so, a good example of that is iFlix in Asia. iFlix made a decision. I don't know if they were slowing down. I don't know the nuances of their business, but they made a sort of very bold decision, I don't know, a year ago or so, that they were just going to do all their subtitling with machine translated subtitles. And I think it got very painful very quickly. And they retreated from that position, I think, within 3 or 6 months, and went back to human translation or some hybrid machine human editing work stream. So I think that is, unfortunately, that's sort of how it goes, is that it's a cost of acquisition on the early days, and then it becomes a cost optimization model. And if you don't value it, then you won't pay for it. And I think that's really that is a very legitimate risk for localization, because if people have tended to think of localization like buying gasoline. When you're driving in your car, and you all of a sudden you see that gauge hit maybe a quarter of a tank, you start to say, okay, well, I need gas. And so you say, well, where's the petrol station? Oh, there's one right there. Is their price relative to the market normal? So, you wouldn't stop and buy it if it was 70% over the market. But if it's basically the market price and it's convenient, then you use them. You have no particular affinity for that gas station. It's just one that's there. And I think that that has really been, and probably I'm not as familiar with all of the localization industry as you are, but my guess is that's probably a paradigm that is true in most parts of the localization industry, and that there's probably some pockets like, literary translation, or maybe very big deal legal contract translation, that's not, those decisions aren't made on those vectors. But generally speaking, people treat localization like a commodity, and they buy it like a commodity. And I think that's a disservice to it, particularly in the entertainment space, but probably in all parts of localization.
And I suppose as well, one of the things that strikes me, and I think you touched on this also, is that you, as a media company or media entertainment company, you probably know if you've gone too far, because you're going to get market feedback on the quality of subtitles, on the quality of the dubbing. How does that kind of audience and market feedback factor into, the process of managing your suppliers, or generally the decisions that companies are making with regards to localization?
Yeah, well, I obviously can't really speak to all of the nuance of Netflix, because there's a lot of stuff within Netflix that's confidential. But I can tell you that, generally speaking, I do think that people pay attention to that feedback, and they are interested in it, because if you make a B2C product, you want your customers to love your product, and and part of it is that they will love it in another language if you're a big successful company. I just was reading an article last night. There's a show on Netflix called The Queen's Gambit, which is a chess show. It's sort of a phenomenon right now, and I believe the article said that it is a hit in 63 countries. It's number one for Netflix in 63 countries right now. Now, simple math means that it's a hit in 60 countries that don't speak English, roughly, 59 maybe, right? And so that means that it was very relevant that it was localized. And it was obviously localized. It was a great show, but it could have been butchered in another language and people wouldn't have watched it. So that means that it worked. The localization worked for that piece of content. And so I think that, I do think that feedback is relevant. And I'll give you an example of the way I would think about it. If I'm not a movie director, but if I was a movie director, I would want to know, how is my show done in the United States, and how has my show done in other countries, and what might be the delta, or what might be driving that delta. And sometimes it's going to be, look, it's a story that just people can't get. They don't understand it because it's a very American or a very British phenomenon. But if it's otherwise should be a show that is pretty universal and pretty human in nature, then I'm going to start to look at, well, who did my localization work? Because localization is half the movie in another country, especially in a dubbed country. A dubbed country, it is literally 50% of the movie. It's all the audio. So, movies are made up of basically video and audio, and it's 50% of the experience. And so if I'm a creative talent, I'm going to really want to know who's the custodian of my story, who is the custodian of the audio mix that I set in an audio suite for 6 months and like mixed it and made sure that it got the way I wanted it, and did it get done faithfully internationally. And so I do think that increasingly this feedback loop that you talk about as a consumer is going to be really relevant, not only to the platforms, but also to the creative talent. And I think one of the things that we will probably do in EGA is to create better ways to have that feedback loop, published and for people to be aware of it. And so, I don't know what those will be yet. They'll obviously be defined by the Insights Committee, but there is a committee within the EGA that is particularly focused on this problem set, which is how do we get a better signal on how the localization industry is doing for the creative community. And it doesn't exist today, but I can tell you, you can look at Facebook, you can look at Reddit, you can look at some of these things, you can look at customer complaints. And then probably the best thing you can look at if you're a platform is abandonment. How many people watched it? When did they stop watching it? How fast did they stop watching it? And what were the trends? That's one of the superpowers that Netflix has always had, is incredible insight into their viewer consumption model. And so, if you look at things like, completion was very high in this language, but very low in this language, it is kind of a directional indicator that there's something more to look at. But, localization is very hard to figure out in terms of was it good or bad?
I think there's also a big responsibility sometimes. I watch obviously with my kids, right? They're 5 and 7, and they get part of their language learning through dubbed content, right? And I'm a bit of a language geek, of course, but if it's if it's really poorly dubbed, a lot of it is cartoon, so it's not really dubbed, right? But if it's poorly translated and it's very verbal, like English verbalized, and German should be a little less so, I'm a little concerned. I'm well, that's not really how you actually speak, right?
Yeah.
So I'd probably move on to something that's slightly better. You mentioned some of these. You mentioned the iFlix example with MT, but and that seems to have been a fail. But what's your take on, for production, cloud dubbing, for example, or the kind of AI technologies like, MT for subtitling generally, and then there's this whole new thing around synthetic voices and machine dubbing and all of that. Is this 5-10 years? Well, it's great, you guys play around with it, but this is not going to hit production anytime soon, or what are your thoughts there?
Wow, it's a deep question. It's funny. I'm very careful about predicting technology, because I remember reading in 2007 that MIT, probably one of the best technology institutions in the United States, said that it would be 20 years before there would be autonomous automobiles. So we're talking 2027, and both of my cars drive themselves. Well ahead of schedule. And so it's really hard to predict these things. But I will say that my general thought is, for entertainment, machine translation will arrive roughly at the same pace of when you would read a best-selling book that was completely generated by a Google engine, or, and so, I think that's still probably a ways away, because I do think there's something about the human element of translation that people can sniff out fairly quickly. Something that's just not it wasn't touched by human hands or human minds or hearts, right? And so I think that is something that is very apparent. But what I will say is, I think automation and technology making the human process more efficient is something that is already happening and should continue to be embraced. And so I think so on the machine translation piece, I would say making humans better at doing the human part is probably happening now and will continue to become a big factor. And I remember actually at a Languages and Media conference, somebody had a quote. And I wish I could have attributed it to the right person, but they said that computers are really good at doing things that are hard for humans, big math computations and things like that. And they're actually quite bad at doing things that are easy for humans, like interpreting if somebody's happy or sad, or having empathy. And so I think that's really true. And so I think to put that in a category, I'd say it's already happening. And if it's used correctly to make humans better at doing their work, I think that's a good thing. As far as synthetic voices, I think for certain types of content, maybe audio description, I remember reading an article that said that in a weird way, people that are visually impaired, they actually prefer synthetic voices. Now, I don't know if this is true or not. This was an opinion piece. So I please don't, troll me on this later afterwards, because I don't know this to be 100% true. But what I have heard is that they enjoy it because it's the world they live in. A lot of assistive tools that they're already familiar with are synthesized. And so it helps them differentiate between what is dialogue in the content and what is an assistive tool to help them interpret it better. And so, again, I don't know if that's true, but that's what I've heard, and it sounds logical to me.
Makes sense.
And I think that probably, the thing to remember also about content is it's not all the same. There's some content that costs $500 a minute, and there's some that cost $5 million a minute. And, I think that you have to look and say, probably on the low end of that tier, synthetic voices will find a home faster than on the high end of that spectrum. And so I think that that's probably also, a relevant thing to consider, is that this is a spectrum, and some of these things and these technologies will find a home faster on one end of the spectrum than the other. As far as cloud computing goes, or cloud dubbing, I think that when those offerings can replicate the experience of dubbing in a studio, they'll have relevance. And imagine, I think one of the things you've seen with COVID is people, at least in the United States, people are moving all over the world. People are leaving Los Angeles and going to move to Idaho or Texas or somewhere else. And I think that if those technologies allow really great professionals that would otherwise feel compelled to live in a region, allow them to move or live somewhere where the cost of living makes more sense, or they can, they have a personal affinity to live somewhere, but they can get relatively the same experience and the same quality of work. I think that, again, those will find traction. And so I don't know if they're there yet, but I do know that COVID has accelerated, not only a bias to try them, but also investment in making them work better. There's been companies that have been toying with it for a long time, but there wasn't an impetus. There wasn't a reason to do it. And now I think you're seeing it. And I also think that, nobody could have ever seen COVID coming. I mean, nobody did, obviously, not fast enough anyway. And so I think that what it has done to the industry is made the industry think a lot more about disaster recovery. And, how do we, and especially entertainment, because people have craved entertainment more so than ever. I mean, every metric around viewing has gone up. And so I think the general interest in entertainment has been constant. And so people have, started to look at these tools as a disaster recovery possibility, if nothing else. And so I think, but there are also a lot of complexities on the other side of it too. And so, there's some people who like going into the studios. And so it's just a complicated thing, but I definitely think that there will be a growth in remote dubbing in very much the same way that, file-based deliveries became normal after the accident in Japan that wiped out the tape manufacturing facility for Sony. So in 2011, there was a tsunami that basically crushed the factory that made videotapes. And so everybody who was sending masters around on HDCam SR had to quickly find a new way to send content. The content couldn't stop moving. And so instead it just became file-based. And everybody had been wanting to be file-based for a long time, but there was never, nobody could get the CapEx, or nobody could get, a paradigm shift. And then all of a sudden it became an imperative. So
sorry, that was a global supplier, like they had a sole supplier thing? Like there was one company in Japan that did that?
Sony. So Sony,
okay.
So everybody was kind of on the fence that eventually things would go file-based. And so I guess Sony, it's probably like there's probably a white paper at Harvard Business School about it or whatever, but Sony had consolidated all their manufacturing to one facility because they didn't see a huge future for manufacturing videotapes. And so when that tsunami hit, it basically, and I might have had the date wrong, it might have been 2008. I can't recall the exact date, but when it hit, it wiped the factory out. It was the same one that wiped out the nuclear reactor sort of in northern Japan. And when that happened, you couldn't get these videotapes anymore. I mean, almost instantly, if you didn't have tape stock already on hand, you couldn't put out masters. People were taking old masters and erasing them and re-recording. And it was, and then all of a sudden it was like within 6 months of that shortage of tape stock, the supply ran out. The tools to make new ones, were gone. And so people just went file-based. And so, luckily, I hope we're going to have a vaccine. I think if we didn't have a vaccine and we continue to get more and more waves, I think, remote dubbing would really be rooted. If it was another 6 months, I think, it would be a complete shift, and may never come back to it.
So I wanted to briefly revisit something that you touched on earlier, which was investment in the media localization, globalization space. How do you think investors are seeing this space, and why do they find it interesting?
Well, I mean, I think what you're seeing is, big investors. I mean, big, Shamrock and Visual Data just got, I think it was Endeavor Partners, I think, that basically bought into them. And then you have SoftBank. I mean, you don't get much bigger than SoftBank in terms of investment. And so I just think that, and then Carlyle started it off with the purchase of BTI, back some time ago. And then Altor, the Swedish company, Swedish investment company. I just think that they tend to be very good at looking at trends and looking at growth trends and seeing, they tend to look sort of 3 to 5 year windows. And there's really no way that you can slice the media and entertainment space over the next 5 years and not see massive growth. And so, I mean, like I said, next year alone, you have BritBox going international. They just launched in Australia, but they have aspirations to go to other countries in 2021. You have CuriosityStream. You have Peacock is getting ready to launch internationally. Amazon will continue to expand. Apple Plus will continue to expand. These are big companies that are making big commitments to international growth. And I think everybody realizes rightly that localization is going to be essential to being successful. And so, probably to some extent, they look at it and say, we can get in that window before they get to that deceleration curve in the S curve. So it's like there's this window, and it aligns very well with their typical models of investment, which are 3 to 5 years. And another one is Platinum and with Deluxe. I mean, these are all big companies that make that have big positions. And so I think they just look at it understandably and say, the next 5 years, tremendous growth, and we can be in and out of that market in that timeline. And so I think it's just a very simple understanding that, the industry is essential to helping support the aspirational goals of these other bigger media companies, and so it's a good place to make an investment.
So, Chris, you've been at this now with EGA for what, a couple of months?
About 7 weeks. Yeah, about
7 weeks. Wow. Okay. So what's the roadmap? Let's go 12, 18 months. What are the kind of maybe immediate steps? And then what are some of the bigger priorities in 2021?
Yeah, I mean, well, certainly we need to get ourselves organized with that committee landscape that I discussed earlier. And then really we want to spend energy in education, and that's partially education for the industry itself. So, trying to do, what I would call professional development type of education. But then it's also a lot of engagement and education to the creative community. I live in an area of Hollywood that is, I have a lot of neighbors that are in the industry. And, when I first was approached about this, I did sort of a pressure test with some of my neighbors. And I said, hey, do you know what happens to your content when it, leaves the United States? And, overwhelmingly they didn't, or they had a very limited understanding of it. And even people like, there's a great Graham Norton clip with Zac Efron, and he's talking about the voice that plays him in Spain. And I don't want to disparage anybody, but you can watch the clip. And he basically says, look, I'm not happy with this fixed voice that now plays me forever. And so I think that, one of the things we want to do is to engage with those communities to help them understand how the industry works, and where they can, if they're unhappy with elements of it, where they can actually lend a voice or influence how that work gets done. So that's a lot of engagement and outreach to the creative community, a lot of education, both internally and externally. And then I think, the other big thing is there's some low-hanging fruit standards that we want to work on, and we'd like to get one of those done in 2021. We have a full 12 months to try to tackle that. So maybe we won't go after one of the prickly ones, but we'll maybe try to figure out one that we can win quickly in. And then I think, the other thing is really that insights piece. I think really starting to get a better understanding of the importance of good quality localization in terms of consumer impact. So I imagine I hope the Insights Committee will come up with one study that we can do maybe in the FIGS that is sort of like a propensity to spend type study. So maybe we'd say, we'll look at, the FIGS, and we'll do maybe survey 1,000 people or 2,000 people and say, hey, how important is localization to you? And do you feel like in general that you're being well served as a non-English native speaker, or could you get more benefit out of a little bit more quality? And so I think we'll do those things. I mean, we hope to work with a lot of organizations to achieve those goals. And so, one of the things that I'm dealing with right now is to find the right partners that are similarly interested and that can help us facilitate the mission of EGA. Because, one of the things that is important to me is that we're not seen as representing any one sector or area of entertainment localization, but actually we represent the whole ecosystem. And when the whole ecosystem gains affinity with the creative talent, that's good for everybody. And so we want to find some strategic partners that we can work with that have like interest, and really try to make the whole industry regarded in a more highly way, a more prestigious way, and more critical to the enjoyment of entertainment globally.
That's a great way to wrap. So thanks so much for taking the time, Chris.
Yeah, thank you. I look forward to seeing it. Yeah.
Of course, and congrats on the launch again of EGA. Let's catch up soon. All right, take care. Bye.